Welcome, welcome, welcome. Glad to see everybody here. Welcome in Self-Titled. Welcome in Markham Rocks. Good to see you, Skylar. It's been a minute. Glad to be here for episode 13 of the ASPEC podcast series. I'm Tai Y. The ASPEC podcast series, well, I'll say Tai Y. I use they, them pronouns. And I'm the creator of the ASPEC podcast series. And the ASPEC podcast series, I started to, dispel some, myths and misunderstandings about, asexuality and aromanticism and really look at the wonderful diversity that exists under, the ace umbrella and the aromantic umbrella, and to really take a look at this through a lens of intersectionality. So today I am joined by two wonderful folks, Sarah and Catherine Holmes from the Aces and STEM Discord server. Would you like to introduce yourselves? We'll start with Sarah this time.
Hi, hello. I'm Sarah Cosgrove. My pronouns are she, they. I am based in the UK and I'm one of the co-founders of the Aces and STEM Discord server. It started, actually, we're probably coming up to our 4th anniversary, probably next month, I think. And it was myself and Jasmine Scarlett, who is another fellow Aces and STEM. In fact, actually, Jasmine was the only out asexual person that I probably knew at the time, I think. But yeah, so we started this together as a way of actually trying to get folks to meet and talk to each other. And then it just turned into a full-on Discord server this many years later. And it's amazing to see like how many people we've met through there, but also just seeing this sort of community there as well. In terms of my day job, I work in science communication. I also have a background in equity, diversity, and inclusion, or EDI. And my background is also in biology as well. But yeah, really happy to be here, Ty. I'm really looking forward to chatting.
Absolutely. I'm excited to be chatting with you both. I've been wanting to get folks from the Aces and STEM server on here for a while now. And I know that you joined us last episode as well, Catherine. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so you haven't gotten rid of me yet. I'm here for one more week. Yes, so to keep it brief, because I was here last week and I had a big introduction then. Yeah, I'm Catherine Holmes, or Kate, they, she pronouns, and I'm a final year PhD student doing quantum mechanics. Aces in STEM, I'm a loyal fan, so I'm not an admin like my two other participants in the podcast. But I'd like to jokingly say I'm the number one recruiter that isn't an admin, because goodness knows I publicize it, and I think a good at least like dozen to 20 people are there because I'm just so passionate about this community that I've been able to see grow since its inception. And on top of that, in terms of science, yep, PhD student, I do psychom and advocacy, and sometimes with Sarah, which has been lovely.
That's for sure. And I will mention that outside the role of a Twitch streamer and podcaster, I am also a fellow PhD student in climate science with a focus on permafrost and climate models. And I also, as you may have guessed, do a little bit of work in ACE and Arrow advocacy. Just a guess, maybe. But I am so excited to be here with both Sarah and Kate. I know that the Aces and STEM server was a major reason that I came to learn a lot more about my own Ace and Arrow identity. So it's been a really important part of my journey. So it's wonderful to have both Sarah, who introduced me to the server, and Kate, who was here with us last week and got into some really lovely chats about, oh gosh, losing my train of thought. Episode 12.
I ranted about my relationship for like
Yes,
too many hours.
amatonormativity and the importance of platonic friendships and unconventional relationships in the Ace and Arrow communities. Exactly. Thank you. Uh, so today we're going to be chatting about, being ace in STEM. So the first question I have kind of as a little bit of a starter is, when did you come to realize your ace in arrow identity? And how easy or hard was it to come to this realization? Who should we start with? Do you want to start, Kate?
Yeah, I'll give a summary of what I said last week. 2018 is when I realized, oh, I might be asexual. It's a shame that it was in 2018 that I came to realize, because my friend suggested back in 2015 that I might be, but it wasn't until after I realized that I wasn't truly comfortable in relationships and intimacy and contact that I was starting to question, oh, maybe I'm not straight. And then in looking into it and finding some conversations, I found out I was ace. And I kind of speed ran acceptance is kind of how I saw it. I had a lot of positive people in my life, my current partner being one of them. And about 2022, I realized I was aromantic, probably on the side of the demi-romantic scale, because I realized my platonic relations and the love I found from non-romantic partners really did complete me. And that's why, whilst I'm in a relationship with my current partner, it's more of a, it's unconventional. There's relationship anarchy, and so those are my two identities.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And I absolutely have to say that I followed a similar trajectory myself, figuring out, 2019, coming to realize I was aromantic somewhere 2021 to 2022. So very much can relate. How about yourself, Sarah?
So I don't identify as aromantic. I am aromantic. My history has been very much having crushes on boys in school, to then dating boys and then dating men as as became an adult. And so I think for me, it was so maybe to give a bit of context, I'm age 35 now. When I first came to realize that I'm asexual is in 2020, which 2020 was a bit of a time for people realizing things about themselves. I think there's multiple reasons for that, but the kind of having time to self-reflect and being at home a lot, I think, was a driver for me. But the other thing is that because ace communities are online, it meant that I got to engage with a community whilst going through the early part of the pandemic. So that was really, really actually helpful and important to me around that time. So the other thing I should also tell you about me is that I'm married. I've been married, actually, we just had our 7th wedding anniversary, and we have been together since university. So we've been together since we're 19 years old. And this is something that I do get asked about quite a lot, is actually about the fact that I am a married asexual person. And people ask, like, how does that work? Or how does your husband feel about it? It's actually, when I give talks as part of my advocacy work, it is, I do get asked a bit about the marriage aspect, which is, yeah. So for me, coming to realize, it did take quite a what feels like a long time, although there are people who realize they're queer, much, much later in life than this as well. But for me, there's a lack of information around asexuality. That's one big part of it. I also went to school during Section 28. If you don't know what Section 28 is, this was a law brought in 1988, repealed in 2003. It was brought in by Margaret Thatcher, and the phrasing in the legislation is the banning of the promotion of homosexuality. So there was no way we could talk about anything queer related while we were at school. So it affected education, to think about schools. It also affected museums and libraries as well. And even when it was repealed, it did take a long time for schools, and still something that schools are still working on, to do any kind of conversations that is queer related. So there's that sort of in the background as well. And then the other thing for me is that I just didn't realize I didn't experience sexual attraction. It's really hard not to know that you don't experience something when you don't experience it, if that makes sense. So it's a thing where I've had to rely on actually asking people, well, what does sexual attraction feel like to you? For me to realize, oh, this is not a thing that's happening to me. But I think because I was always interested in dating, and I've have a history of dating men, it was just a thing that I just assumed I was straight, and therefore it just took a really long time for me to kind of realize that I am ace. And even when I was starting to identify as ace back in 2020, I had a lot of imposter syndrome around it. I'm like, what if I'm just a straight person looking like I'm taking up space in this community? What if I'm imagining all of this? And this is I know this is something that a lot of other people also experience as well, which is very comforting for me to know at the time too. So yeah, that's just a bit around kind of my journey there. And is there anything else I should mention really as part of that? I'm sure more will come out the conversation, but I'd say for me, it just took me a really, really long time. Even when I knew about the label, I think I also had a lot of misconceptions of what the word asexual meant as well, in addition to that. So yeah, that's just a bit about my experiences.
Absolutely can relate to the imposter syndrome, and being myself, I very much find I fall somewhere under the gray umbrella, not haven't quite really figured out, a perfect micro label, but I think that added a little bit of complexity to my experience as well. And sure, the imposter syndrome is real. I know a lot of aces that continue to feel, the imposter syndrome. I still do to this day. But I know that my experience is not a allosexual experience. So over the years, I've become more comfortable with that realization. And I think, was it you, Kate, that mentioned in 2015 or so a friend potentially suggesting you might be ace?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
I remember it because to also share my age, I'm 26. So at the time I was in sixth form college as I think probably 17-year-old, and I remember it because it was around the lunch table, and I used to say my catchphrase, which was yeah, when it comes to like relationships and sex, like I'm just a straight person who doesn't want sex. Now don't get me wrong, there's plenty of ALO people where they are ALO and that applies. People are free to identify as they, wish and what labels feel right. But then when my friend turned around and said, "Hey, have you considered you might be asexual?" And I was like, "That's ridiculous. How dare you suggest I'm not straight? I wish to be normal." And it was a lot of gosh, I don't even think it was internalized like homophobia, for example, because I had a lot of like specifically gay role models, gay adults role models in my life, but I think because I never really knew that asexuals existed and you could be one. Uh, in that case, it was like fear of the unknown and I guess internal phobia about like not being ALO specific.
Hmm.
So yeah, I guess that's kind of just why it's so important that we have discourse about asexuality and aromanticism now, because it's
Mm.
almost impossible to know what you lack without the comparison to people who have it.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Do you mind if I add in something here as well?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
because the other barrier I thought I realized I should have mentioned for me is, yeah, in terms of what I mean by like what I thought the word asexual meant. I just thought the word asexual meant you're just a person who doesn't want to have sex. And that's definitely common within the ace experience. But it isn't a universal experience. And then also there are allos who also don't want to have sex for other reasons as well. Um, and so I just kind of never assumed that to be a label for me because it was something I did have. And it was something that sometimes I was actually fine with. But then I look back on my 20s, and there were times where was in sexual situations where I was like, I don't want to do this, and I don't know why. I just couldn't explain why. But that's another reason why I never considered it for myself. Was that too. And so this is why I bring it up, to sort of say that, well, this actually could be part of an ACE experience as well. And it's also the fact we have these similarities with the broader queer community, because, for example, you have lesbians who will be in relationships with men, will have sex with men, but not realize they're lesbians for a really, really, really long time. And it's not as simple as, oh, well, you dated men, so how could you be a lesbian? It's just that, well, they just didn't know, if that makes sense. It was like, well, this seems to be okay, but something seems to be off.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that's one of the reasons why I really relate with lesbians, is experiences like that.
Totally. And the issue of, compulsory heterosexuality in that, regard, where the default is you're hetero until you are proven otherwise. You must enjoy sex. You must be in a heterosexual relationship as society sees it. So, there's really pressure from all around you, media, friends, the general public. If you aren't in a relationship, what's wrong with you is kind of what society says. So absolutely, it's very hard to come to realize that when you've got all this pressure from all sorts of different directions telling you from the time you're a little kid that, you haven't made it until you've had a relationship where you're, having sex, and, it's romantic in origin and all of the above. So very much, comp het is a real problem.
Absolutely. And also, and you probably talked about this on the podcast before, but also sort of the gender you're brought up as, and or soon to be, will also have an impact on your experience. And I think that's another thing, is that, so being brought up and socialized as a woman, is that it's kind of a thing where, oh, women don't, then they're sexualized objects, but they're also seen as like people who don't enjoy sex or as much, or like, oh, that's just how it is. And so that definitely has a part to play in it as well.
100%. Yeah, we definitely talked about that in the chat we had on compulsory sexuality in episode 11, where we talked about just the absurd rules that compulsory sexuality brings to the world about women, as you said, being sexualized, but at the same time are expected to not like sex, but at the same time at some point are supposed to engage in it, and just the absurd rules that compulsory sexuality brings. So we definitely talked a lot about that in episode 11, and just how it's used as a tool of oppression and control on so many levels. And I know that you've chatted about Sherronda Brown's Refusing Compulsory Sexuality in the past. And that book really was a great read for me and helped me better understand kind of this, the tools of oppression and control that compulsory sexuality, imparts on society.
It's a brilliant book. Absolutely brilliant book. I think it's probably, it's at least one of my favorite ACE books. It probably is, maybe potentially at least in like the top 3, if not like my top favorite one. It is so good. They're such a good writer, for a starter. They're such a good writer, but also just I've gone back and reread it as well, and I anticipate I will go back and reread it again. I'd highly recommend it to anybody. And it's good to have. I feel like a good thing is they actually did a definition of asexuality, and I do feel like there is some of the 101 stuff in there actually, in terms of this is what this means. So I'd say I'd highly recommend anybody to read that book. It's so good.
I also really like the fact that they go beyond saying asexuality is merely a lack of sexual attraction, and they go beyond and say asexuality is experience with sex that is counter to that of the allo experience, or is different than that of the allo experience. So they go beyond saying it's merely because, unfortunately, this idea that aces are lacking brings up a whole bunch of negative connotations and stereotypes that get played into media.
Yeah, I really like that definition quite near the start of the book, and how broad it was. I really, really liked it. It was just, I say, anybody listening to this, go buy this book, go borrow it from your local library, get your local library to bring it, get it in.
Absolutely.
It is so good, so good.
So I typed it into the chat. It's called Refusing Compulsory Sexuality, a Black Asexual Lens on Our Sex-Obsessed Culture by Sherronda J. Brown. Wonderful book. Really highly recommend it. Definitely learned a lot from it. I would say it is not the book you're going to necessarily read if you're just starting to, figure out asexuality. It definitely goes into things in quite great detail, but it is a really solid book to if you want to learn more and really find out, in much more detail, the complexities around asexuality, especially through a lens of, intersectionality, with, the Black experience, the racism that compulsory sexuality imposes on us. There's just so much in there.
I can also recommend, just on the opposite scale, because you are right, this is not a book for the it's a very serious book, and I've not even managed the courage to dive into it yet. Conversations, yes, but I think it's going to be a very impactful read. If you want to, as for a light introductory book, I can recommend one, which is Ace and Aro Journeys, and I will just get the author now.
I think that's Cody Diego Oriens, is it not? Is that the new one?
It's an anthology book by the Ace and Aro Advocacy project.
Yeah,
so it's is it by Cody? I don't.
No, it's not. I know the one. I know exactly the one you mean. I can visualize the cover.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah, it has a bunch of arrows and flag colors. And that so on the other end of the spectrum, that's good for actually, I guess, if you're questioning and you want an easy introduction into the community and alternative, deep discussions into definitions. That one's a nice one.
Ace and Aro Journeys.
Ace and Aro Journeys, a guide to embracing your asexual and aromantic identity by the Ace and Aro Advocacy project, as I've just read from the front page.
They also have a lot of really good stories on their website. I think that's the other thing I found incredibly useful is just reading through the stories. We're an incredibly diverse community, and it's not to say that other communities aren't. I just from my experience, we are an incredibly diverse community. So that even when you provide the definition, it really doesn't give you the whole view of what asexuality could look like for lots of different people. Yeah, and then also just the fact that the way you feel might also change, and that's also another really important thing to sort of talk about as part of the experience.
What I would love to see from the Ace and Aro Advocacy project, and honestly, I think what they have vocalized in the book that they want to see as well is a future book which focuses on aspec communities and cultures from non-Western cultures, because they do admit that the anecdotes and survey data, whilst globally available, was also predominantly received and answered by Western countries. So
I see.
So hopefully in I don't know, next decade, we could get some books that focus like Compulsory Asexuality, which focuses on intersectionality with race. It would be nice to see even more journeys from those intersections.
Absolutely.
So to kind of add to this, so we have International Asexuality Day, which is on the 6th of April. And if you go to their website, it has the list of all the different organizations and countries from around the world. There is so much good activism and advocacy work that's happening internationally. And so I want to big up one group, which is Aero and Ace Philippines. They have a Discord
Oh.
server, they have a Facebook group, they have an Instagram account, and I think they're on Twitter as well. Sorry, I say Twitter. I know it's X, but I keep saying Twitter. But I know I'm still gonna keep calling it Twitter. But basically, they're across multiple platforms. One of the things I remember seeing them do on Instagram is they have been they posted some resources or talked about some resources where they were looking at because sort of language around asexuality will tend to be kind of in English, and they were looking at how they could potentially look at Tagalog terms. So Tagalog is one of the languages in the Philippines. There's many languages in the Philippines, but the national language, so you've got two national languages, English and Filipino. Filipino is very much based on Tagalog. So the reason why I know a lot about this is because my mum's side of the family are Filipino. And this is something I also try to think about when talking about my own experiences, is thinking about so kind of thinking about the experiences, also those who are in the diaspora and those in the Philippines, and there's similarities, but there's also differences as well there too. But yeah, so they're a group I think are doing really, really great work in the Philippines. Really, really proud of them, and I always love to talk about them at every opportunity. But just know that there's so much going on internationally, and also therefore so many stories we could probably get internationally. I also think that there has been, I think, because one of the challenges is also having resources around asexuality within active those sort of contexts, and so many that you can find free online on are in English. And this is the thing: it's in English, and it's written from a Western perspective. And so, in terms of learning about asexuality, that can actually provide barriers in place. Now, in the Philippines, like one of the main languages, as I mentioned, is English. English is widely spoken, but there's so many other countries where you won't have that. So I know that there have been Spanish speakers that have been translating into Spanish. I think that's some activism work that's been also resources produced in Spanish, even not just translations. So I know there's some South American activists who talked about this as well. But just know that like so much is happening internationally, and so having a book that exists like that. I would love to see this too, but the stories do exist. I know they do exist online. We've also had asexuality conferences where we've had international speakers as well. So the stories are very much there. It's just about how do you then get this together. And I guess one of the barriers is the publishing process, isn't it? So that's that's the thing, is kind of then actually having people who write books around asexuality, that being published itself. And just thinking about that I think is in itself. But I would say that looking online, the stories already exist. They absolutely do. I get what you mean in terms of we might have to have a bit of time, but I'm thinking, well, actually, I do think they're already there. So yeah, sorry, I rambled on a little bit.
That was good.
No, it's absolutely important to talk about, because I know I touched on the fact that in episode 11 that a lot of what we see in the media, a lot of what we see in the broader literature comes very much from a Western perspective, but I didn't delve into it in any great detail, partly because I unfortunately don't, I'm somewhat ignorant in the literature outside of that, which comes from a Western, English perspective. So it's absolutely important to talk about. So thank you. Do you want to talk a little bit about, biases around asexuality in STEM at this point?
We can too.
Yeah, Sarah, I'll think about that. Sarah, do you have any?
So I'm also worried I've been doing a lot of talking. But I'm happy to start.
This is why I'm vocalizing. Please go ahead, buy me some time.
Absolutely.
My head is
No, it's the
gone.
time. Well, I could tell you, so just thinking as a biologist, one of the things So one of the things I did a couple of years ago is I asked people to share stories, anecdotes that I can include when I give talks around asexuality, because as I mentioned, the experiences of the community are so diverse, and I really want to make sure that when I can share my personal experiences, but I really want to make sure I'm able to share other people's experience, especially if they are not able to be open and out and visible, to be able to do that as well. Because that's the thing, is there are so many aces who aren't out. We're really amongst the most sort of least likely to be out as well. But I wanted to read out this quote to you, one that I previously shared in a presentation. So it says here, I'm a health sciences student, and the number of times I've had to combat the narrative that sex and desire is essential to the human experience is both alarming and exhausting. A lot of health sciences still assume that sex and romance are essential to life and health. This has more than a few times made me feel as though my field understands me as being something inhuman. That's the end of the quote there. And I remember reading this, and it's so important so this, I feel, really illustrates why it's so important to talk about it within the life sciences, within the health sciences, and me coming as a biologist here, is because of the way, and we go back even to education and the way we the things that we teach in biology there, and how much it's very much one day this will happen to you, and and I could talk a bit more about the sort of sex education in sort of schools as well. But yeah, it's just that thing where we have these norms throughout our curriculum. We have these norms, and then also that then extends to then working within these disciplines. Those are the different norms, the expectation that you will meet somebody. And then the other thing is that it's not really something you can quite drop into conversation either. It's a thing where I'm having to tell people, come out to people, and and that's tricky quite in itself. But broadly, also we do have issues in terms of things like so bullying and harassment in. So I know that the Royal Astronomical Society did a survey of a bullying and harassment survey that published, I want to say maybe a couple of months ago. It was definitely this year. And just seeing how LGBTQ plus people are affected within that as well. I also know that, so if you compare it to, for example, the social sciences, where there might be a bit more openness and also just general awareness about anything LGBTQ plus related as well. So I do think there's a thing where you have this, so already less awareness in comparison to maybe other sectors, but also the fact we do have issues in terms of discrimination within the sectors. Also, if we think about the field of science itself, it involves things like international travel. There will be barriers kind of set there as well. So just kind of think about all those different things. I feel like we have been going in the right direction, but I think the problem with asexuality is that it's such an invisible thing. It's something that's not really talked about, and it's just whether it's a thing where is there enough active inclusion there, really. But it is something I think has been getting better, and the fact that I have had science, I've had there's a pharmaceutical company who had me into their company earlier this year. I spoke at the Francis Crick. It's the fact that the science institutes are interested in learning. They are interested in booking me in as a speaker. So I feel that I'm hoping change is happening. But I will say this is somebody who's not a researcher. I'm not in academia. I am in science communication education, which is a little bit different. And the fact I have worked in EDI, so my maybe sense of things may be quite different because of sort of what my everyday work looks like. But I do feel that there so much needs to be changed, and that goes down to what we're teaching and to inclusive work environments. And then the other thing to add to this, just as another layer, is if we look at the Equality Act 2010, so this is the Equality Act, equality laws for the UK, it does not include asexuality explicitly in the way we describe sexual orientation. If you go and look at the legislation, and the wording for sexual orientation includes so same-sex attraction, opposite sex attraction, and in both sexes. That's how it's worded in the law, by the way, rather than what my beliefs are. I prefer using the word gender, for example. But that's how it's worded in law, and it does not have that in sort of very specifically including asexuality. Whereas in New York, the state of New York, and also I think it's a state, Tasmania in Australia, they do include asexuality in their laws explicitly. And this therefore means that for employees, it's one of those things where there's a little bit of a gap there too. So this doesn't just affect STEM sectors, but it is something that then comes into the context of STEM sectors. And then also then thinking about, as I mentioned, traveling internationally. Yeah, and the fact that you don't, even if you do have laws in countries where there is protection, so based on sexual orientation, so from discrimination, is asexuality also included that? Is it aromanticism even included in that? I know in Tasmania they include the aromanticism as well, but it's just, yeah. So those are kind of some of the things I think about when thinking about the experiences of asexual people in STEM sectors.
Absolutely. And, I think aromanticism is even less often considered than asexuality.
Mm,
Uh,
absolutely, absolutely, I agree.
I think, yeah, okay, great. You brought me time and inspiration. Thank you.
Good.
Teamwork. Um, Essentially, okay, I guess I'll build on that and agree with that in terms of, I guess coming from so I'm currently a student, but I feel like I'm in the weird middle ground of I'm 26 now, so I'm very old. I'm not very old to be a student, but like I'm in the interim between student and staff almost. Um, I feel like does it impact my research? Probably not. Does it impact my being at university? Yes, because it's I mean, I guess it's one of those spaces of you need to find your community and your allies and your friends when you're queer in case, well, A, for kinship and you know, you know, friendship and just positive human connection, but also to protect yourself in case anything does happen or you do just like experience any like discrimination or prejudice and you need someone to go to. And that's why it's really important that there are pre-established networks, community safeguarding and policies for queer people. And I feel like I've seen the least amount of safeguarding and representation for asexuals and especially aromantics. Um, Now, I was actually quite pleasantly surprised because I did go digging into my personal universe, like like definitions of discrimination and like who do they protect. And whilst in the UK, asexuality and aromanticism is not a protected characteristic, within the university policy it actually is. So if anyone discriminates me for these reasons, then at least on paper that does define as bullying, and there will be consequences. So that's a really nice thing to come across. um, in terms of awareness and community, though, it's definitely lacking. I would say there was no or very little ace and aro awareness community before I engaged with the university to help build it. And I think this happened about 2 years ago that I start working, maybe 3 now, that I started working with the student union to organise with a wonderful organiser called Natalie to arrange Ace and Avo social. And the reason they didn't have any before is they ran it once, one Ace and Avo social like a few years prior, and exactly one person showed up. And, so it didn't get traction, which makes no sense because depending on what survey you look towards, is it 3%? From the Rainbow survey, Sarah, that might be
So the Stonewall Rainbow Survey, published 2 years ago,
Mhm.
in their I think it's a set of 3 Ipsos surveys summarized in that, but they said 2% of the population. However, if you start looking at different generations, so
Mhm.
at the time the 16 to 25-year-olds, or Gen Z, it was up to 5%.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things that's so much bigger than you think.
Yeah, exactly. So there's always going to be ace and Ava people at university. Um, so I don't know. I think it's a shame that it isn't, you know, already built into the nature of networks to consider. But then it takes, individuals and ace and ace spec people to actually build like the resources and actually push for this. I mean, it's been quite, I guess overall my experience has been quite good, that whilst I feel like I've been the one spearheading the like awareness and sorry, I'm repeating myself, I'm very sleepy. I apologize. Whilst I feel like I've been spearheading a lot of this, I have also been quite well received in me asking to do this and to get help to do this. At the end of the day, there's still things that I wish were defaults. Like the university in particular has how to be an ally page, and it's still missing how to be an ACE and ARO ally. And it then begs the question of, okay, whilst you're in this organization, how much do you, or like in this case me, how much do you spend your time volunteering to this work because no one else is doing it? Because volunteering is a very good and wholesome thing to do, but you can also get spent doing it. And you know, it's not really fair to be burnt out when, you know, it's like, it's more like a systematic problem, it's a structural problem within academia, within workplaces even, that this isn't already being addressed by a team of people who are being paid to do effective EDI. Yeah. What do you think, Sarah? You have EDI, plenty of EDI experience.
This is very, very common. The other sort of experience I think of, and I remember having a conversation with someone. Ooh, I probably feel I had quite a few conversations over the years, but one of the things that you'll see sort of employees encouraged to do quite a lot is go be STEM role models for young people. And I've seen, for example, women. This happen to women, and I remember having a conversation with someone like, right, so they tell me this is important, and to do this for the young people. And the thing is that if you're also within a field but it's less of you, so less people like you as well, then a lot of pressure then goes your way. And also your field, so not just with your, let's say in your institution, but across the field, or just in terms of visibility. So let's say with engineering, what's it now? Is it, I don't remember the most recent statistic, but I remember when I first started, I think it was like 7% of women engineers. I think it might go up to 11% now, it might be 12. But it's still like quite a small number just across the field in general. So you're told to do these things, but then it's this thing of, well, is this actually benefiting my career when I am looking for future jobs? And it can do, but not necessarily. And this is also a thing of, well, you need to be spending time doing this stuff. You need time and research. You need time for publishing. And the fact you need those publications to be able to then be more likely to get funding for research, right? You both will know a lot more about this as PhD students, but it's that kind of cycle thing, right? So it's this thing of, so you're asking me to do this thing that's really important, but then it's taking me time away from this, and I'm more likely to have more time taken away from my research than others because I am a marginalized person, and you're trying to fix a problem, right? And but then it's this thing of, well, if I don't do it, then who will? And then you feel so much more pressure on you to then be the one to fix things, when really you're one person, right? You're just one person who's just like, I just want to be able to get on as well. I don't know, Kate, from speaking to you, like, you're also like, the fact so much has been down to you, but also just the fact that if you're either the only one who's openly out or one of the few openly out as well. And this is where I kind of go back to, so I know that organizations love to be able to have employees, so we'll think about university staff and students who feel comfortable to be open and out about themselves. But I think there can be a thing where the ones, because there's so many barriers to people being out still, then the ones who open out, there's like, I don't know, it's like this additional pressure, isn't there? And then you're like, well, if I don't do this, then who will? And it's something I've really had to sort of think about within my own advocacy work, is that there's so much I want to change, but there's only so many hours in the day. But I have really, I've gone to a space where, like, at least I am being compensated for some of my time doing that work, really, which then allows me to be able to continue doing the work. And there's also dips. There's going to be times where you will have time for it, and there's going to be times where there's going to be less time for it. There's also going to be times you might get burnt out from it. You might get there'll be certain things that'll happen where you might just need to sort of spend time to rest. But I think it's a thing where, because you know the work's important to do, there can also, I say, that pressure, but also just a bit of, for some people, can be guilt as well. Well, this is not getting done. It's like, yes, but you've also got to look after yourself, right? But it's difficult, isn't it? Because this thing of it's important, but then, as you said, it's this thing that then you're having to dedicate a lot of your own personal time to, and that costs you time. That's the thing at the end of the day, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's why honestly one of the most exciting, like one of the proudest moments of the year for me was I was able to do the story collider, so giving a story about STEM, but I was invited because I had a story about the theme was sex and romance, and I had a story about how I am an asexual aromantic person in a loving partnership. Like I had this story shot, and the pride of that comes from it was a spec advocacy, but it's the first time I've been paid for like anything like it's something I would
Mm,
often do voluntary. Psychom and A spec had always been voluntary at that point, but I was also reaching the point where you know I want to do this stuff regularly. So to actually make the barrier and say, "Oh no, you are valued. We will pay you. What you bring is beneficial to everybody." And we acknowledge that whilst it wasn't a lot of money, it was still like we have acknowledged that this will compensate for part of your time because
mm,
you deserve at least that. Um,
mhm,
I think um, sorry, this might be slightly tangential, but I guess something else in terms of awareness and STEM that kind of bothers me is you mentioned a few times about being queer and able to travel. Asexuality, it's invisible, so I feel less you know struggling with that than I do if I was like openly gay. But
mm,
one thing that does stress me is I'm in the position where I'm applying for postdoc jobs now. PhD's finishing. I'd like to carry on doing research, and I need to find senior academics with money who would like to hire me to join their research group and continue doing research. Now, um, this is probably the similar case in a lot of jobs, but a research group is essentially an academic family. You don't get to choose them. You're going to be spending like tens of hours with them each week. Sometimes going to socials, pub culture is always quite a big thing in the UK. Finish on a Friday, go to the pub. So you'll be spending a lot of professional and personal time with these people. And
mm,
it makes me more anxious being an ace person entering these spaces, especially because I'm in mathematical physics, where on the whole point of if you're in a minority in a certain group, so for mathematical physics, being a woman, ignore the other intersections, being a woman or being perceived as a woman more specifically makes you a minority.
mm,
I have to deal with that baggage that I might enter a research group where somebody might, be misogynistic to a degree. But I might also reach a group where they don't know about asexuality and respect it and appreciate it. So I am nervous going into what will likely be a male dominated space who, um, you know, just might make me feel othered.
mm,
Which and I'm an early stage researcher. I haven't been in a situation before. So I don't know how well I will be able to cope in such an environment because it's also similar for PhD students. You're fresh out of a master's, you get thrown into a research group, and goodness knows how well could we have stood up for ourselves when you were like 22 years old. Um, so I'd like to think for me I'm a bit more adept now, but I couldn't stand up for myself that well back then. So, um, that's definitely a worry of mine, and I think that's probably quite a relatable thing. I think that's also one of the reason that the the Stonewall report that Yasmin Benoit did also just talked about how, as you said, Sarah, being asexual and aromantic is the identities that are least likely to be out. And it doesn't help that even the small things, like I'm filling out these applications and there's the diversity, drop down menus, race, religion, and orientation. And in orientation, I've only done 2 so far, but I imagine this is a norm. I'm put down as other.
Mhm.
They've got heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual. They do not have asexual, which is
Mm.
a bad start for your next employer. Um,
Mm.
it's not the be all and end all, but it's all these little things add up, and if you're already feeling like you could be othered, in a very intense academic environment before you even step through the door, it's no wonder people walk away from
Mm.
this career section. No wonder people don't aren't able to just keep going until they're a professor, because it's already like a bit dog eat dog. And I don't know. I know very few women who have progressed far in their academic career, and I know even less queer uh, queer people and queer women.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
yeah, and this is more of a criticism on just the general expectations in science, like the idea when someone says scientist, you have we've kind of like been brought up with an idea of what that looks like. If I say what does a scientist looks like, it would probably be like an Isaac Newton or Einstein type, like or aged white man who
Mm.
cisgendered and heterosexual. Um, and when that's the kind of image you're having to combat, saying no, 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 you can not be any of those things. In fact, you don't even have to wear a lab coat. You can just be behind a computer. Then, I mean, it just all adds to the difficulty, and especially when you have to deal with the unique constraints of academia funding, applying for grants, applying for uh, actually grants is probably a big one as well. Um, there's so much biases and so much prejudice that every like little tick you have can make it just a bit more harder.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I won't go into detail about, because I realize what I might say potentially could be tricky for others, but also just thinking about there's a bullying, harassment, also things like sexual harassment as well that kind of comes
Yeah.
into this. And I won't, as I say, don't want to go into detail about it here. But it is a thing that has been talked about. Where so if you were to research and say so to do a web search for like asexual stories with that, it is a thing where, and that's also quite invisible. It's not really just generally talked about as a thing in terms of things like harassment and coercion that can happen. Um, and it all comes down to the whole thing of, well, I'll make you straight sort of thing. And then
Yeah.
if you imagine that something that's happening in academia anyway, and it also is particularly, if it happens to women, that's just another layer added on top of it as well. So yeah, I just wanted to pick up on something I see in the chat. So from Rit Zash. So aces are invisible in queer, trans spaces, and also in STEM circles. And this is another thing. I just remember speaking to somebody who's ace in STEM and they're trans, and they said it's hard enough being trans. Like, why would I then have to bring up being ace? Like, that's just another thing that I need to bring up. And so that's the other thing, is that people will be ace alongside other queer identities, but they may not necessarily share that because they, even if it is a really important part of their identity as well, they may not necessarily do that. So yeah, so that's just something I just wanted to kind of add there to that comment too. But yeah, so that's the other things that we could also potentially be missing when looking at STEM perspectives, is that what could we be missing when we there are actually so many people who are just not out as ace, and just therefore like the issues can be so invisible because of that. You mentioned data collection as well as kind of part of that as well. So I know that there was a report about sort of within the physical sciences, which was done by the Royal Society of Chemistry, the Institute of Physics, and the Royal Astronomical Society, I think around 2018, 2019. I need to pull up the report and see what the statistics, but I remember asexual was included in that. And I remember a couple of anecdotes in there was around it's just not, asexuality is just not a thing talked about. So I think there's just very much that invisibility within. So that's something that I remember picking up from that report, and just it's just not talking about it really. Oh, an ad is about to start.
Do you want to go on a break since we're in an ad break?
That sounds
Yeah,
good.
sure.
All right, so I guess we'll use this ad break as a chance to go on a little break, grab some water, and we'll be back to continue the chat. So see you in, what do you want, 5 minutes,
I
or
can
do
do
you...
5 or
Yeah.
quarter past.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sounds good. All right, let's run the ad, and see you back in 5 minutes then. All right, welcome back, folks. Thanks for putting up with the ad break. I know how frustrating and annoying they are, but it gave us a chance to get some more water and take a little bit of a break, so thank you very much. I will mention that Ritash is a fellow ACE advocate. They run a podcast as part of wrong.org, and we're chatting with Gabby, Ace Space London, I guess a week and a bit ago, about asexuality and the decolonization of asexuality on Instagram. And the plan is for me to appear with Iritosh on an Instagram live on one of the wrong.org upcoming podcast and chats. So very excited for that. Definitely go follow Ritash on Instagram. I can grab their link if you'd like. I kind of want to tie off that discussion about EDI and, in academia, and how it's sort of expected to be done for free. I myself have recently, been getting more involved in EDI. I'm part of the Queer Trans Alliance at the university, and we kind of have a mandate to try to guide. Some of the work we've been doing lately is thinking about how best to provide guidance around pronoun use in the classroom and on the administrative systems within the university, because there's a big disconnect between IT and the queer community in many ways when it comes to how best to use pronouns on the IT system, and where they should be stored, how often they should be displayed, and in what cases should they not be displayed, and so there's a lot of issues we've been tackling with regards to that. But all of that is expected to be done as part of your service, and service as a grad student is absolutely done for free. There's nothing, you're not paid for it, but at the same time they expect you to do it. So I can very much relate to that. However, with the work that I'm doing with the Ace and Arrow discussion group, I'm actually finally being paid as of this, as of July, I started getting paid. So I'm now a paid employee at the organization, which is amazing. And with that, work I've been doing through the QTA and with my local organization, I was reached out to by one of the folks in the Connection Collective at our university, and I've been asked to talk about, and they'll pay me for it, asked to talk about finding community as a graduate student, particularly as a queer graduate student, and the challenges that queer graduate students face with the isolation of research, being isolating, and the fact that at our university, undergrads have a dedicated space for to us LGBTQIA plus students, but there's nothing for graduate students. So I'm going to be chatting about that in a few weeks. So looking forward to that. But yeah, service is a tricky one because you're expected to do it in academia, but also you're expected to do it for free. And as somebody who's marginalized, as Sarah was chatting about, you have to advocate for yourself. And if you don't do it, then who else is going to do it? So just kind of switching gears a little bit, and we've chatted about this at many points in the past on the podcast, media representation of asexuality and how awful it is for the most part. And so when we think of STEM representation, particularly ace STEM representation in the media, it's of the antisocial recluse who has no emotions and wants nothing to do but focus on science. So the Sheldon Coopers of the world, the Sherlock Holmes. What impact does this really negative representation of asexuality have for, actual folks who are ace in STEM? Do you think this really poor media representation has unfortunately clouded the perspective of, folks in science and created biases against, aces in STEM? Anybody want to kind of start with that?
I would like to rant about Sheldon Cooper like
Absolutely.
I did last week because I if there's a Venn diagram on paper of I guess like codings the character has explicitly and inexplicitly, often for a laugh, and things I have sincerely in a I'm a fully formed human who is more than just these characteristics. I am a neurodivergent A-spec person in quantum mechanics. Like the amount of times I hear Big Bang Theory and that character get referenced when I tell people what I do is it is incredibly frustrating because it's a caricature. It's a one-dimensional caricature that has been associated with one asexual person may be and one autistic person may be. And I don't find it that damaging in the academic community because the thing is, at least in mathematics, where I find myself at the moment, it is quite a neurodiverse space. I don't know. It is whether people are diagnosed or not. Or I guess the awareness of neurodivergencies are present or not. I interact with people and it feels like we're on similar wavelengths and we've got similar things in common. So we're not going to turn around to each other and say, "You're Sheldon Cooper," because we're more similar to each other than we are to this fictional character. This more is damaging when it comes to people outside of the academic community that don't engage with scientists and don't engage with ASPEC people, because these are the people that come to their mind first. And it's tricky how I engage with it, because if someone's taking an interest in the science I do, or my identities, I don't want to shoot them down and be overly negative towards them, because I appreciate they're listening to me, they're trying to learn, and I don't think I tend to experience it in a malice way. But at the same time, I want to break that expectation and stereotype, because the stereotype doesn't exist. Academic communities are incredibly social. even mathematics ones, we are incredibly social because we want to talk to each other. We want to share our passions, our questions, seek help, and seek comfort. You are very rarely a person locked in a room with a laptop. So I guess yeah, so I feel like it's more of an external thing. I will say on the bright side, it does make me feel incredibly cool when I do science communication. Because I can stand up on stage as a queer woman slash genderqueer person with an ace flag on a PowerPoint, and say, I study quantum mechanics, let me teach you about it. And it just, it completely shatters the expectation. And then I'm like, okay, compared to that, I feel like I'm the coolest person in the world. Now compared to reality, the full diversity of people, I'm as mid as most people, but just for that moment, I feel incredibly good about myself. So that's my thoughts and my gentle roasting of the character.
Absolutely. And, as somebody who's not in quantum mechanics, but in the field of science, the Sheldon Cooper character irks me because when people talk about, or when I talk to people about the fact that I'm a PhD student in science, they're like, oh, are you like Sheldon Cooper? And I just want to pull my hair out. I'm like, that is not at all what grad school in the sciences is like. And unfortunately, people outside academia have no idea, so they see this character and they assume that's what it is. And I think it's damaging on many levels, unfortunately.
Actually, it's a quick question. Well, and Sarah, please chime in. So I can think of many aspect scientists, both in the public eye, science communicators, and in my personal life around my department, which is amazing to see. But whilst there is a lack of aspect representation in media, when I'm thinking about it, I'm trying to think, is there any, out of the slim pickings that we have, whether explicitly aspect or just aspect coded, is there any science based characters that speaks to the ace? I'm struggling to think of any that aren't, like, at least ones that are specifically human as well. So I'm gonna discount like debates about like Star Trek and Data, for example.
Yeah, that's the other thing. And then there's the high kind of the sort of dehumanization aspect there
Yeah.
as well you can get. And it's a whole thing about being cold and not having any emotions, which you kind of get with data. And it's that thing where you just said, it's the coding of characters rather than explicitly saying this is an asexual character or them talking about it, isn't it? And the thing is that when we think about media representation of asexuality, it's only really been the last few years. I know that what's the name of the organization in the US? They did a report where they talked about ace rep, and I will say the ace couple did a really good dive into this to go like, what do they mean about these ace characters? And to my knowledge, at least within TV and film, I can't think of any ace spec scientists. However, I know that the book world has been quite good with aspect representation. So potentially in the book world, I'm not a huge book reader, so if anybody wants to share if they happen to come across them in books. But this is the reason why I kind of like openly, well, I think the thing is that I was kind of put in the women in STEM sort of box fairly early on in my psychom career journey. So it's kind of like, well, I guess there's that. And then, but I will openly talk about what I'll tend to do in science shows, because I'm not really sure how schools kind of feel about it. I'll be like, here's a progress pride flag, and then move on, and just say that this is an important flag to me. And I talk about my culture background. I talk about where I grew up. There was actually about a year ago, I was doing a talk for an event which had sixth form students. So for those who aren't familiar with this sort of the English education system, sixth form tends to be the last 2 years of school. So I'm like, they're over the age of 16. I'm like, oh, I could be a bit more blunt here about this. And thank you, Ty, for putting in a book recommendation in the chat. I'm going to look at that. But anyway, sorry, I won't get distracted by that. So yeah, basically, I was like, listen, they're over 16. I'm actually going to bluntly say I'm asexual, but like I'm very brief about it. I talked about my cultural background. I even say this is the reason why I'm talking about these identities. You know, I want to talk about like the fact that this then impacts me as a scientist. Moved on, and a couple of the evaluation forms written by by teachers. These are two separate teachers. They were like, "Why are you talking about sexuality? You should just be focusing on
Oh,
so two separate ones. And I mentioned it for what, a minute? I talked about my culture background. I talked about where I grew up, but they didn't seem to have an issue with this. They seemed to have an issue. And, you know, as I say, this is for those who are over 16. I was like, at this point, it should be, I mean, I should be able to talk to young people about it before this point. I was like, they're like, it just becomes less of an excuse at this age as well. So yeah, it was just, and that's just something that I'm like, well, actually, me talking about, and I was really blunt, like I was very clear about my sexuality. But that also shows why I need to keep doing it as well. And I will talk about not just about being asexual, being an asexual scientist. So yeah, but the other issue we have is that even those someone like Sheldon Cooper, it's coded. That's the other thing, is the interpretation, which means that you also, for the viewer, they will also have a really narrow view of what asexuality is. And so I mentioned earlier that I've asked for people for sort of any stories that I could share in presentations. And I actually have one here that does relate to Sheldon Cooper. It says here,
yeah.
I believe the most common question I get when I'm asked about being ace is generally something like, oh, you are like Sheldon from the Big Bang Theory. This does not at all explain my experience as a grey ace or my experience in STEM, as I work in a very different field than the field that Sheldon Big Bang Theory is portrayed in. The range of experiences under the ace spectrum are quite varied and nuanced, and unfortunately mainstream media fails to capture this. And that's the other thing. And then if we think about also the fact we have the coding someone like Sheldon Cooper, if we have someone, another one that's talked about in sort of fictional stuff is Sherlock Holmes. These are also white men as well.
Yep.
And so when we think about media portrayal, and I sort of talk about TV and film, we're talking a lot about Isaac from Heartstopper, which is, that's been really important for queer youth, I will say. So I will, I have had queer youth tell me like how important Isaac's rep is for them. The other, one of the best ones I've ever come across is Todd Chavez from BoJack Horseman. I thought the way that they did Todd in that series was incredible in comparison to other representation. But these are also, it's not just the fact that we are not having that representation in science, it's also the people we're representing as well. There are other characters who aren't white men that have been within TV and film. But even when we talk about ace characters in TV and film, another one, Cash from Heartbreak High, I think is the name of the series. Cash, and he was another one that's talked about, another white man. So that's the other thing, is the ones that we tend to also talk about when people talk about ace rep in the media will also be white men as well, even if they're not the only ones in the media. So yeah, that's just kind of the other things. Kind of falling into stereotypes a bit, the Ace and STEM Discord server, the busiest academic channel, because we have a list of academic channels, is the maths channel, which I do find quite funny, to be quite honest. And I do feel like it does fall into stereotype, but as I say, that the issue is it's the coding, it's the fact that we're not shooting these diverse experiences, but also like the fact, what's it like to be asexual in academia? It doesn't show that really. That's the other thing, is like you get this coding, but you don't really see what could be potentially positive or negative experiences, or somewhere in between those in academia. You're not seeing the full experience of that as well. The final thing I do want to end with, sorry, I realize I just interrupted you, is we have such a lack of queer representation of scientists in general, and that's the other bigger part of this as well. It's just the other contributing factor. Often the only person that gets named when I ask, can you go name a queer scientist, is Alan Turing, and that's it. a lot of the time. And that's, so I think it's also part of that bigger problem too. Sorry, Kate, what did you want to say?
Oh, actually, no, that was a really good point. I've got a follow up to that one, but I just wanted to also say, there's one ace character out there that's so obscure, and I absolutely love from a DC TV show. So like something fairly
Mm.
big budget, who is a person of color and was not STEM. I would describe them as I guess like a rural engineer called I think it's Esperanza Cruz. So I just always want to show that there's in the very few characters out there, I think that one's a really nice one. It's if nothing else, there's just one nice scene on YouTube where this person who does not realize they're not straight has a conversation where they're like, "Oh, you might be ace," and they're like, "Oh,
Mm.
that's nice." Now, granted, that it still is in the stereotype of someone who is not ace introducing the terminology, but I don't. Yeah, I mean, I'm still just happy to have it.
Mm.
In terms of actually queer and science history that you just picked up on, um, it's because we only really have okay. So the terminology for asexuality dates back to what is it? The 1800s, late 1800s.
Yeah, late
But
1800s at very least, yeah.
yeah, but it gained more. It started to gain more notoriety in the early 2000s because of the human and I can never say the word human amoeba.
So I
Yeah,
think what
and then also Aben.
what
Yeah,
kind of kicked it off was the blog My Life as a Human Amoeba, and then the Haven for the Human Amoeba, and then obviously David J starting Haven.
yeah, exactly.
Mm.
So I guess in terms of actually talking about queer like science and history, there isn't really people we can easily point to and say we have concrete, written statements to say they were not, straight and they may have been ace. Um, like I think good examples is there's some mathematicians out there that okay. Um, Quantum mechanics has a complicated history with the founding fathers. Because the best way I can describe it is me and my PhD student and friend. We went through the list of them and made a good and bad list in terms of their ethics and dubious nature to see who would be, in our opinion, fairly morally good. And most of them were not in our modern art. Um, I won't say who, but there was two on the good list, and that I quite like Max Planck and Dirac. Now, Dirac is somebody who I've read quotes from and their story, and to me, I think they would be diagnosed with autism these days. I think they are A-spec. I think they are ace and aro and very likely demi in at least one or both of those categories. Because the story with Dirac is, he very okay. He also seemed misogynistic, so maybe he should be on the bad list. But he showed no interest in women, no interest in relationships. He met the wife of another famous mathematician, which I forget the name of now. And he shows no interest whilst he writes in his diary that she was coming on to him. And apparently this goes on for a long time, and he continues to say, essentially he hasn't got any, he continues to have no interest, and he generally does not have interest. Until one day he does, and they get married. So to me, that feels like a very demi-aspec experience. But this is just diary entries to go on to, and whilst inherently in society the default person and therefore the default person in history is assumed to be cis het, like an alo, like this is something we've assigned onto everybody. Like, it then feels weird for me to say, what if he wasn't? What if he was A-spec? Can I put this on a PowerPoint? can I challenge this notion of compulsory sexuality in our scientific history? So it becomes really like awkward because there's a lack of aces in STEM in history, or at least who we've deemed is or have explicitly said they are, and therefore I know so many modern current aces in STEM, but I know of so many concrete examples of aces in STEM in history. So we're lacking role models, not even in the media, but in our literature.
Yeah, it's so tricky, isn't it? Because and this is something I have so something I should mention is for the last 3.5-ish years I've been working on a freelance basis for the organization who founded LGBT History Month in the UK. We're actually getting prepared for our next one. It's very exciting with our new theme. It is very exciting. I'm very excited about the new theme. But as part of that, we highlight different historical figures. And the problem is we're putting modern, well, or labels we use today, I should say, labels that we use today, and also within a Western context as well, on people of the past. We're basing it on what evidence, like for example, evidence of relationships. But we don't know if, for example, I mentioned what could be the experiences of some lesbians of marrying a man first and then realizing, oh, actually, I don't think this is right for me. We're not, so we can sort of see like, oh, this woman was with this man and then she was with a woman, oh, she might be bi. But it's like, well, actually, is it? Is that the case? And this is the problem. And then with asexuality, because it tends to be a thing where you are less interested in relationships. Well, it's like, why is that? Is it somebody who just wanted to be really dedicated to work? Well, all were ace and Ariel. And yeah, this is why it's really, really tricky. So you can have like, oh, I can interpret this because at the end of the day, we also straightness will still be then still assumed as a norm. It's kind of that thing where straight until assumed otherwise. So it's this thing of, well, actually, we shouldn't assume they're straight either. As well. But it could be a thing like you just said, Kate, like actually this is why I think this person could have been ace. And I think that is it's just really, really tricky because we're not really giving them a chance to say, this is who I am, this is how I identify. Also, potentially at a time where they may not want that shared of themselves. If, let's say, they died more recently, family members may not want their identity shared publicly as well. So that's the other kind of layers to it as well. Yeah, so this is why I find it really, really tricky to talk about and label people in history. But I think it's a thing where like, well, I think this person could be ace. Like, yeah, absolutely. But it's just the records we're basing it on. And then also within science, the fact that and sort of looking at Western science, for example, how that's being dominated by white middle class men as well. That's the other thing on top of it, is also who was allowed to be part of the science club because of sexism. Also thinking about things like class. But interestingly, the first use of the word scientist was actually for a woman. I'm trying to remember who it was now off the top of my head.
Really?
Yeah, as because I think the phrasing at the time was men of science, and she couldn't be that. So I think it had to be. So she was called scientist, and I'm trying to remember who it was. And I've forgotten off the top of my head. Yeah, so that's just an interesting fact that I learned along the way. But yeah, it says also those other compounding things, and then also even when we talk about science in our school curriculums, it is very based on white Western science, when actually certain things were done in other countries around the world before certain discoveries, and I put that quotation marks, were made as well. So it's even how we talk about science is still a challenge today. But yeah, and then even if we have these historical figures who may have been queer, people don't necessarily know that. And this is something I feel like you really highlighted well, Kate, is that too.
One thing I just wanted to point out also, this is tangentially related, but in terms of who gets to be a scientist, it reminded me of the article that was recently released and put in the Aces and STEM chat. I'm gonna try and look for it and put it.
Oh yeah, that one. Yeah,
Yeah.
that is a perfect example of what I mean. It's I'm trying to remember what it was. I remember It was to do with Halley's Comet, wasn't it?
Yeah, so okay, the title of the article is X-ray Evidence of Black Math Scholar Portrait Reveals Snubbed Uncovered Genus. And this was by The Guardian. And I'll send it to you, Kai, so you can put it in chat. So this isn't ace related, this is racial related. But I think it is excellent.
Definitely.
So it's in the chat.
Thank you.
Oh, well, it's in the Discord.
Yeah, I got it.
But yeah, that's a perfect example. And when we think about, for example, decolonizing the science curriculum, these are just examples of what we mean. Is just that, well, actually, what there was so much science happening in many other countries around the world. When we sort of, as they had the science curriculum, like, right, we're going to learn about Newton, right, we're going to learn about this person. Like, where did Newton base his ideas from? You know, I think didn't his and he's another one who's been talked about as potentially being ace as well. It's one of those things of like, was he gay? Was he ace? Could be both. That's the other thing. But yeah.
Yeah, no, you can also that is one. I think Nikola Tesla is also one that's been debated.
Another one being talked about. Yeah, absolutely. Another one that there's that kind of stereotype of, oh, they were roommates. For example, we'll talk about two women living together, and there are times when you're just like, oh, come on, they were in a romantic relationship. But there's also times where I'm like, well, what if they were roommates? Like, what if it was like their version of a queer platonic relationship? And that's the other thing, is there's that kind of thing of, there's that frustration, understandably, where it's like, no, these women were in a romantic relationship. I completely understand that. And actually, yeah, we look at it as like, there they are. But there's also that thing where, could that potentially overshadow, like, well, actually, what if it was something queer, but it didn't have to be a romantic and sexual relationship, could it? It could still be queer in a different way. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Like, for example, like, I'm in a romantic, like, I live with my partner, but like, if history looked back on me and said, oh, look at these two heterosexual people being together in this household, I'm like, no, it's an unconventional partnership. I'd rather you call me housemate historically.
Yeah.
And that's kind of why I often think, oh, some of these women may have been, like, roommates in an aspec way, as well as some of them being lesbian. But I mean, I guess that's also true for, like, maybe some heterosexual couples out there who are deemed to be heterosexual but may be like us, secretly enjoying a more complicated platonic relationship.
Yeah. Or they, for example, if it's a man and a woman, they both could be bi as well. And that also, so there's plenty of different examples of bi erasure, and that's just, that's one of them. And it's just that thing where it's like, it's always that assumed to be straight. And this is what I mean by, like, when we look at historical evidence, we're basing it on things like that as well. When, for example, if you're somebody who is bi, in some cases, it may be safer for you, for example, if you're a bisexual woman, to marry a man, right? That makes the most, that is the safest option. But then it means that we would never know that that person's bisexual. And as I say, using a word that we would use today as well. Yeah.
How are we doing for time, Ty? Oh, wait. Are you saying words? I can see your lips moving. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, it is almost 5 o'clock. I know that you said you needed to go then. So
I mean, yeah, it's go for it.
So I leave it up to you. Do you want to kind of wrap it up here? Do you want to continue a little longer?
I
could go for 10 more minutes. I mean, Sarah, is there anything you desperately want to talk about? Because you know very much about it.
What do I want to talk about? I could talk about another media rep, which is House. Do you both know what I mean about that episode of House?
Yes, it's horrid. Absolutely horrible.
Because because that's the other thing, is that kind of, so for those who've not seen it, there was an episode of House, I think around 2012. So also really not that long ago. Like, Ace Media Rep has changed, and I'm sure there's probably other examples of this kind of thing. And unfortunately, some of the things they talked about in the episode are kind of those misconceptions you still see around, generally speaking, anyway. But basically, House sees a couple, a man and a woman, who both say that they're asexual, and he doesn't believe it. He thinks they're either lying or something's wrong with them. One of them was lying to make the other partner happy, and then the other person magically gets cured by House. Right? I think is how the episode goes.
Yep.
And that's the thing. And so it's a thing of, oh, do you have issues with your hormones? Oh, is there something? And for me, when I didn't realize I was asexual, I considered going to a doctor because I felt like something was wrong with me, right? And this is why ACE inclusion in healthcare is so, so important. But it's the fact that that was an incredibly damaging piece of media, really. And it kind of, it's also that thing where people might use that to kind of, well, to make a storyline, and then also for asexuality to just not be taken seriously. When we look at, for example, the National LGBT survey, asexual people are the most likely, I think, to not disclose their sexual orientation to a healthcare practitioner. So in the survey, it said, have you disclosed your sexual orientation to a medical practitioner in the last 12 months? Was the survey question. I certainly wouldn't. I don't need to. And just seeing what Ty's written here. Yeah. Fortunately, I have had I'm sure I've had the hormones question from somebody before. I'm sure I've had it as well.
I by a close friend as well, and it's like, oh god, please don't, please, you know what? Please don't use, like, I don't even want to say science against me, more like misconceptions of science against me.
Oh,
Like,
yeah, misconception of science, absolutely, yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Because like the thing is, like, then what do you say? Like, I don't know, as a straight person, do you think you're missing hormones that make you attractive to the same sex?
Mm,
Like,
mm,
what do I say? It's like, well, okay, you're not attracted to the same sex, are you? So me
mm,
neither. I've just gone one
mm,
step further. Why
mm,
do you need to quantify this
yeah,
medically?
yeah, yeah. And
Exactly.
then yeah. And then unfortunately, so the other thing that's also come up is, and I say this is not something I'm going to go into detail about because I appreciate this could be a triggering conversation, but we also see ACEs at higher risk of conversion therapy is another thing that's also seen in the National LGBT survey. And it's just that thing of, and it's something that can happen within medical settings as well, or something that happened in the ACE in the UK report. This was the project Kate mentioned earlier, led by Yasmin Bedouin, which showed how disclosing that you're asexual has meant that people have experienced barriers to accessing healthcare. So some that were worried about losing access to mental health healthcare, rated healthcare. And also that's quite important because we also see higher rates of mental health issues in the ACE community, looking at the ACE community survey, and also looking at the Trevor Project also have some research around asexual youth, and they saw similar rates of mental health issues in comparison to the broader LGBTQ plus population they surveyed of young people. So yeah, it's there's another one of the other stories in the ACE in the UK report was about how a couple couldn't get access to IVF because they thought
Mm.
they'd be honest about being asexual, and also the fact that doctors just didn't understand. And that's the thing, is all of this, it can unfortunately can lead to harm. I say it can lead to things like conversion therapy, but it comes from a place of just not knowing about asexuality. It's so when we have these comments said about us, and it's not great, but at the same time it's like, well, these people, they don't know about asexuality, and the fact these misconceptions have been shared by things like that episode in House as well, and that can further perpetuate the problem. So I'm hoping with better and also more diverse representation, so in terms of diverse stories and sort of in-depth experiences in the media, that maybe that might help. But it's also a thing where healthcare professionals really need, like, that needs to be part of training, and that's also just more broadly, actually, looking at healthcare experiences of LGBTQ plus people in general is still not great. There are actually still barriers for same-sex couples to access IVF in the UK. So basically, if you are a man and woman who are looking to conceive, and I should say cis man and woman, then you would try to conceive, I think it's for a year, and then you can go on IVF funded by the NHS. I don't know if there's anything around any waiting list, but this is but basically you eventually do qualify, whereas often same-sex couples have to go through private healthcare first before being able to get IVF funded by the NHS. So this is the thing, there's so much barriers to LGBTQ plus people in general, thinking about gender affirming care for trans people and so on. There's so much. So this is something that really needs to be part of the training of healthcare workers so that they are more aware. But the other thing I should also mention is there's a paper, an article that myself and Stella Steckenberger, she's another fellow ACE in STEM. She is studying medicine in Australia. And we co-authored a paper, which I will put in the chat. I should warn you, the link is really long for it. I apologize in advance.
Drop it in the Discord because you may get
Discord.
blocked by Twitch.
Oh, will I?
Unfortunately.
Oh.
Yeah,
Okay,
Twitch doesn't like
I
you
will do
dropping
that.
links if you're not a mod.
Oh, I see. So I've just done that. Oh, okay. But in this paper, we talk about the medicalization of asexuality, and so Stella has previously published on this. Yeah, she's previously published on this, and she was able to bring her experiences of that. See, it's a really long link. She's previously brought her experiences of that into this paper, which I was really, really grateful for. But also, I left science research in 2012, so I was so happy to be able to publish again.
Yeah.
I never ever expected to. Yeah, so we share some of our experience in this. We talk about the medicalization of asexuality, and we also talk about the inclusion of asexual people in the workplace. But essentially, it's making sure that with an asexual patient, it's things like not making assumptions about them, and it's things like how they may, for example, want to get things like birth control that might be related, for example, to prevent unwanted pregnancy. But it could also be a thing where birth control can be related to other aspects of health as well. So it's kind of about having those conversations and letting them, be in control of their healthcare essentially, and not denying them healthcare related to them being ACE as well. So that was a really great thing to work on with Stella.
I appreciate also just like the parallels to like a lot of this kind of comes down to as well, just like body autonomy for like ACE folk, and especially with like sexual healthcare, because that's obviously like the hardest one for me to deal with, and I think most people to deal with on ACE spec. One thing I find quite interesting, and something I kind of realized early, like late last year, where like the conversations of ACE and healthcare have like started to pop up more, largely because of the work you're doing, Sarah, as well as like your co-author and Australian, there's a Asexuality Day in Australia. They did a lot of panels as well. Is that where Stella's from, actually?
It's not originally, but that's where she's studying at the moment. And you please do. She has. There's the ASPEC Medic account that I'm going to see if I can find her. But she posts a lot about it. But she's honestly so amazing. Really done some brilliant work. Thinking about like ACE inclusion in healthcare.
Yeah, I'm always so impressed whenever I hear anything. But yeah, one thing that I realized during these conversations is if I'm going into discussions about like sexual health and those appointments, I think I'm more I've always actually been quite open about being ACE in the room, but that's probably more a reflection of me than me being more comfortable with too much information than me being more comfortable in like protecting myself to a degree against potential prejudice. But I think these days I'm probably leaning towards bringing autism into the equation in terms of medical health, because autism is a protected characteristic in the UK. So, and I've always been taken quite seriously because I was diagnosed as a child in the doctor's office when it's to do with autism. And I think that gets me more to where I want to be if I'm like, okay, I want X amount of support. Why do I want it? Well, really it's to do with like my comfortability and autonomy when it relating to asexuality. But I can word this in a way that relates to the exact same things, but in terms of my autism. And therefore you're going to take me more seriously. And
Mm.
it just kind of makes me really wish that asexual was a protected characteristic in legislation, because it would give me more protection in the medical office. Because I do
Mm.
believe, like for the most part, sexual health clinics, a lot of doctors, not all of them, but a lot of doctors do actually want to help. And um, um, sometimes prejudice and lack of awareness and information prevents them from knowing and understanding what's best for you, even if you're asking. And if something's a protected characteristic, it becomes a base cut kind of like, there isn't really a debate you can have against it, because they have to take it for granted that, yeah, okay, that makes sense in the way you do it. And also, I think, because conversation about sexual health is particularly difficult when I'm on the side of ASPEC, where I am sex repulsed. I am very uncomfortable with acknowledging my organs as being sexual organs. I want to just think they're organs on their own. Please don't put connotations of sex with them, because that's not how I will use them. They're just part of me. So it becomes a challenge, because when your body's being talked about in a way that doesn't match how you engage with your body and work with it, then you shut off. For me, I become repulsed. Which is especially a shame when in the same like panel I did with Gabby that you were part of, Sarah, we ended up having a conversation about being ace in like a doctor's office. And in that conversation, when I was talking to you and the audience of like 20 people, I found out more information in that safe space than I had ever received in like the previous like 10 years. I didn't even realize I got like a vaccine to protect against like a certain kind of cancer, which is lovely information to know, but also helps in terms of it prevents the kind of cancer that you need a smear test. And that that sort of testing is not something I currently feel capable of having because of how intrusive it is. It's like, cool, well, it's lovely that I have this, and I wish more people who are specifically older than me in the UK would have had it as well. But without really having the safe space to be able to explain why your identity, why your orientation, why just your own existence makes things harder or more complicated to deal with. Without having the safe space to discuss every facet of you without judgment and prejudice, you don't know what's going to be best for you. And a medical professional might not be able to help or might not choose to help because of those barriers.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, and I think this is something you see historically with queer people in general. It's something I also say with trans and non-binary people as well,
Yeah.
where it's like sometimes you have to talk about because the thing is also just thinking about how healthcare and also who's developed these systems in healthcare. It's not necessarily queer people being behind this as well. In terms of in terms of like for example think of trans healthcare and like how there's obviously trans people working in healthcare, but in terms of like for example when talking about gender dysphoria, like to my understanding, I'm not a healthcare professional, I should really say this, but the conversation I've seen is that that's not necessarily something that trans people have had a lot of say in terms of coming up with a definition. I think, I'm not sure, but basically, yeah, I could be. Am I talking about the right thing here? I'm just very wary that I say I'm not a medical professional, but it's just the way that like when I've seen other people kind of talk about like how like it sort of thinking about like how healthcare hasn't necessarily been designed sort of just in general and had as much input as queer people as possible. I think that's maybe where I should go down. So I've seen other people talk about this way more eloquently than myself. But just wanted to pick up on something that Ratasha said in the chat. ACEs are unnecessarily medicalized and pathologized. My neurodivergence isn't independent of my ACEs, they're mistakenly interlinked. And I guess it's that thing, is like not making assumptions about this. Yeah, it's not making assumptions of the patient really, and having it being led by the patients too. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
Thank you so much to both Sarah and Kate. It's been lovely chatting. I know that you said you've got to leave here pretty soon, Kate.
Yeah, I it's one of those where I'm waiting on people to come to my house and they've yet to do it. So
Yeah. Okay.
but I think wrapping up soon will be good.
Yeah, absolutely. So we can sort of, is there anything any last thoughts you have around being ace at STEM, the challenges of being ace in the medical system that we haven't touched on yet, that you'd like to bring up?
I'd like to share some positive notes.
Absolutely.
On the notion of there isn't a pre-existing community that you reach an academic space and there isn't a pre-existing community, and I think we all three of us have said, looked on the face and thought it would be nice if we had that, and then we end up being a spearhead in creating it in one way or form. Yes, I still stand by my belief that there is a point with voluntary work where you should be compensated, but you also get the benefit regardless of community, love, and friendship. Like, there's so many lasting friendships, you both included. I didn't make Aces STEM in it, but I can think of lots in the university communities, just being out, being connected. Like, you if there's not many of you, you band together often, and I wouldn't really trade that for the world. I would just hope that it becomes more accessible and more available, and more inclusion friendly, including intersectionalities, that more people can enjoy it. There's always so many more prejudices within academic spaces, race, religion, ethnicity, that people can become excluded. That even if you are race and you end up having a second identity and you're in STEM, maybe you don't feel able to join a community, or maybe the community is not able to accept you. But I would hope these things can, be thoughtfully circumvented, and more people can enjoy this. Because I think that's one of the best things I've come out of any, is just the friendships made along the way.
For sure. Absolutely agree on that. Sarah, any last thoughts?
I really like what you just said, Kate.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've met so many wonderful people, like for example through Aces of STEM. But I think like knowing that I'm Ace has definitely like positively impacted my life. It's definitely like impacted my romantic relationship like in a positive way, in that it gave me language that I didn't have access to before. And what was the other thing I was going to say? And then also like it's a kind of reframing of like how we tend to prioritize romantic relationships as the most important relationship, and it's like the one to strive for, whereas I'm like, well, actually my friendships are incredibly important to me. And so just that thing I've kind of reflected on the last few years is like how important friendships are. And don't get me wrong, my romantic relationship is still important to me. It's just like it doesn't have to be like the top of this hierarchy. and that everything else follows. Like my friendships are also still really important to me. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Absolutely, and I relate.
Absolutely. 100%. And, I've talked about it for sure that for me, the platonic friendships, the platonic relationships are so important to my own, well-being, my own sense of community. And absolutely, let's plug that for sure. I'm going to snooze the ad break because the ad wants to come and I don't want it to.
Yeah.
So this is looks like I'll plug it in the chat. Do you want to talk a little bit about what it is?
I just been secretly messaging both Sarah and Ty asking should we plug this? So Sarah is a full-time science communicator. I'm a budding science communicator whenever I have the time and resources. And we are both doing an event in London next month with the Royal Institution and Pride in STEM. So if you like science, queer culture, queer stories, and we will be hosting among a bunch of wonderful people, which I'm sure Sarah will name. We'll be having a little ACE spec table doing some science demonstrations. Sarah, if you want to add on to that.
I don't think I need to. There's also going to be a talk beforehand. Basically, it's just a good old time, and it's I have a chance to come to the Royal Institution. Yeah, and please come along. I do. If you are interested if you're not, let's say, local to London, which is where the event's going to be, but would like to see some ACE science, I am on TikTok on ace.psychom, so that's spelled with two M's, so SCICOMM. I had to really think about that in my head. That's so you can see the any of those kind of demos because I posted them on ACE Week before. I think that's all I kind of wanted to say, I think.
Thank you so much to you both, Sarah and Catherine. Lovely chatting with both of you. We got into some really awesome discussions around, being ace in STEM, the challenges of asexuality and, in medicine and the medicalization of asexuality. And it's been, I think, a really great chat that I've been looking forward to for a while. So thank you so much again. Do you want to, just briefly remind us where we can find you on the socials before we wrap things up?
For me, it will be, so I mentioned ace.psychom, that's also on Instagram as well. And that's probably the two best places to find me. I don't really use Twitter as much anymore. So yeah, I'd say ace.psychom on either TikTok or Instagram, probably be the best place to find me.
I am sadly still on Twitter, and I don't have any other social media accounts. But it's at the Quantum Ace _ between the words. If ever I do get a different science communication account, which hopefully one day, maybe next year, I'll do once the PhD's on, I'll update it on my personal website, which is catherineholmespublic.wordpress.com, and I'll give that to Ty for the chat. Because that's just a website, and occasionally, maybe every half a year, I will update 1 or 2 pages, but not all of them, because that would be too responsible.
Right. So at this point, I think we're going to raid the Fruities raid train.